In your প্রাচীন ভারতের অর্থনৈতিক ইতিহাসের সন্ধানে, you have mentioned that inscriptions throw most important light on the socio-economic history of early India. Will you elucidate it?
First, it's a book published long back. It's an old statement, but it perhaps still has the validity. I wrote this book in 1991 and then revised it, second edition came out in 2002. So, but the basic premise of this statement is that normally when we look at the economic and social history of the subcontinent in the long past, what is called the usually ancient India or early India, up to 1300 AD, then the main focus of historians prior to 1970 was the gleanings from the normative treatises, which is called the Dharma Shastra texts in general, or the Artha Shastra. These are invaluable source materials, but they mainly tell us what one should do, what one should not do, what is something good, what is something bad, essentially prescriptive normative. How to find out what actually was happening or what actually was done. For that, the inscriptions record what may be called the descriptive events, and thereby inscriptions may generate data in the study of social economic history. Not that I must put a caution here. First of all, inscriptions are not stand-alone sources. Like other sources, they have their limitations, and it can be checked, verified, juxtaposed, contrasted with other categories of sources. The advantage with inscription for studying early Indian economy and society is that they tell what was actually taking place in the context of a particular region, and you can date most of the inscriptions with some degree of certainty, which is not available in the kind of literary texts, whether it's a normative literary text or the narrative literary text. So these are the advantages of studying inscriptions. And take for example what we can find out by the study of inscriptions generating social economic history data. These data are not available ready-made. The historian has to frame certain questions by reading various books and sources, and then may see some of these framed questions in the light of sources, including epigraphic sources. The person, it is not me who sort of discovered that inscriptions can generate important data for social economic history. The person who first drew our attention in a systematic way is D.C. Sarkar. By repeatedly referring to epigraphic materials on social economic history, other people also did that. But if you look at the historiography of, say, 1950s, giants like even Ghoshal mainly relied on Arthashastra, Dharmashastra literature, textual sources and normative treatises, thinking that what is stated as norm was almost valid in society. That it was not. The inscriptions can generate data on completely different type of information and of a different category was shown by D.C. Sarkar. I can give one example of this. Let us look at the inscriptions at Sanchi. More than 613 number. All these are small records, not the records of kings. There are only 3 records of kings and rulers as donors. Most of these records are documents stating donations made by a wide range of social groups, including monks and nuns, obviously followers of Buddhism, at the stupa site at Sanchi, because donation is a pious act. So they are recording their pious act in a document, and the donors are keen to leave behind their identity, and identity is a social phenomenon. they are not at all referring to their Jati Varna status, that is what is called the caste status. They are repeatedly referring to their professional background and the areas they hailed from. This is exactly the time, say between 200 BC and 200 CE, 200 AD, when the major Dharma Shastra literature were being composed, like the Manu Samhita, like the Yajnavalkya Smriti. In these two texts, everything emanates from the identity of one's either the four-Varna system or the Jati system. This is the ideal from the Brahmanical order. In the donation to the Buddhist Sangha, at least the donors never ever refer to their Jati status or Varna status, except in the case when the donor is a Brahman. So this is a different kind of a data, different kind of image, which is, I'm not telling this is data is final, but this is an image of what I may call the descriptive category of source vis-a-vis the prescriptive category of documentation coming from normative treatises. So there is inscriptions very special category of information. And later when the large number of inscriptions were copper plate records dealing with land grants, and most of the land grants are located in the rural areas. The rural life, the agrarian scenario, the rural settlement, the rural social life naturally are captured in a very authentic way in these inscriptions, rather than the hackneyed presentation of the village life either in popular literature or the static representation of rural life in the normative texts. The inscriptions can generate data which are datable securely, which can be contextualized in terms of a region, and therefore can indicate a dynamic picture of Indian society and economy, unlike the changelessness, immutable character that usually is presented by the normative treatises. So that is major advantage.
So you are constantly emphasizing that on the differences between the textual sources and the epigraphic documents, and you are also saying that epigraphic sources throw better light on the socio-economic aspects and on other things also of our India rather than the textual sources.
I would say not better, I would say they give a different image, and the textual sources can be juxtaposed, checked, verified, and one has to give the independent images that come out of the study of inscriptions. Inscriptions give something different which are not otherwise available in normative treatises.
In early India, who was the owner of the land? Did individual ownership of land exist, or the entire land belonged to the ruler? What kind of picture do the inscriptions present?
First of all, in pre-modern economic history of India, including that of early India, land naturally is the most important means of production, particularly for a predominantly agrarian country like India. Now the question of ownership of land is neither once again static, nor the same statement can be made cutting across different eras and centuries. There could be a position in historical scenario where you may not come across any notion of the individual private proprietary right of land. And that can be not merely in the very hoary antiquity, but even in what may be called the early medieval times. If you look at South Indian inscriptions, where particular land grants, which are replete with details of rural life and rural material culture, there were, even during the late Cholo times, certain areas within the villages, what is called the Ur area, the non-Brahmana settlement area, where land was held by the community. It's a kind of commonly held land with little understanding of private individual ownership. It is then from 11th century onwards, as Karashima Subbarayulu masterly demonstrated, that warlike activities of the Cholas led to the amassing of wealth in many of the leaders of the army. Then with their increased wealth, they began to purchase land in areas where earlier no private ownership was involved. And these are in records. It went to such a proportion that prohibitory orders were issued in inscriptions by the local self bodies in the Ur non-Brahmana settlement area, that Irajuguluvars, that the persons of ruling houses or royal families are debarred from further purchase of land in the commonly held zones. So this is an area, even in 11th century, 12th century, where the notion of community holding of land is very strong. On the other hand, if you go as early as the maybe something between 2nd century BC and 1st century AD, you have in the inscribed rundel in Bharut, where the image of the an area being covered with coins. Coins are being unloaded from bullock carts. That scene is portrayed with an inscription that Anadapindika, the great rich man during the time of the Buddha, figuring very prominently in many Buddhist literature, is donating the Jetavana for the Buddha. Now here is the catch. The Buddhist story, the inscription merely states the gift of Jetavana by Anadapindika. First of all, the gift of land is a proof of the transfer of land. Transferability is intimately connected with ownership of land. And what is the story in the Buddhist text? That Anadapindika wished to present the Buddha with the pleasure garden near called Jetavana, near the city of Shravasti. He did not own this land, so he purchased the plot, and then the purchased plot was handed over to the Buddha. So the same plot of land, around 6th-5th centuries BC, if the Buddhist traditions are to be accepted, are transferred twice, first by sale, then by gift, which speaks of a very mature sense of private individual ownership of land. On the other hand, take for example the question of land transfer, which begin to be recorded in the Satavahana territory in the early centuries of the Christian era, would show that land could be purchased by a member of the royal family from an individual Brahmana who got his land from his father's inheritance. He is selling the land to the king. So the king's son-in-law actually. Now Bana's son-in-law, Usabadato purchased it. If there is a complete, unquestioned, unqualified royal ownership of all land, which reduces all land ownership under crown ownership, then there is no need for a member of the royal family to purchase a plot of land from a Brahmana by paying a price, and then the purchased plot once again is donated to a Buddhist monastery. Once again the case of double transfer of land. This is particularly very common in the land grants from Bengal under the Gupta rule, say between early 5th century to about close to the end of the 6th century. About 12 copper plates largely speak of the purchase by paying cash of lands, which are then given to some Brahmanas or some temples for the meeting the expenses of the religious performance of that individual Brahmana, or for the expenses to be undertaken by the religious institution. Now there is a catch. most of these lands, landed plots, individual plots of land, were described in the Bengal copper plates as being uncultivated, fallow, almost virgin lands. The money was paid by the intended purchaser, who is also the final donor of the plot of land, to some religious person or institution. Who received the money? The money is being paid to the local administrative office, the district office at the district level. Why? After all, the money goes to what may be called the Sarkari treasury, because there is the Dharma Shastra notion that the ruler has certain proprietary right over what is called in Arthashastra Sita, that is the royal land, khas jameen. But over and above the king's proprietary right over the Sita type of land, there are other kinds of land over which the king was entitled to have some superior, regalian, transcendental rights, like that of over forests, over fallow lands, over treasure troves. So these plots of land in Bengal in 5th and 6th centuries are mostly described as fallow lands. So the transactions of the fallow land is payable to the state administrative body at the locality level. So there is a question of, at some point, for a particular type of forest lands or fallow lands, there can be the question of the royal authority over this kind of land. There are some epigraphic evidence also of, particularly in Satavahana records, of a Rajakam Khettam, the royal plot. Here, the unquestioned royal authority is there. But there is no sweeping case of royal ownership over all lands in early India. There are certain cases. Take for example, even in the Gupta period, the earliest known, latest record, the latest discovered record from Bengal is the one of the time of Gupta, early 6th century, 504, thanks to the editing and excellent translation by Furui, the Japanese scholar. We find as early as 504 in the easternmost part of the Ganga Delta, there were in a single record 28 cases of land transfer by purchase and sale, which means that this is a procedure already well rooted in the society and also in the polity. But there are cases of land ownership by the king in this very specific areas of what is called the royal plots, or the king's superior transcendental rights over certain categories of land. Usually if it's a newly developed land by the undertaken by the administrative mechanism, then those plots will come under royal aegis. Similarly, forest. Similarly, unproductive fallow lands are under the authority of the ruler. But individual plots are given even to the Brahmanas as land grants, which are not for a generation but for perpetuity. Which means that this is something contradictory to the claim of royal land, royal ownership over all lands. So that is not the case. The king is entitled to collect revenues because he is the ruler and who protects the life and property of the subjects. So it is against the duty of protecting the life and property of the subjects, he is entitled to a share of the produce. That is the actual implication of the revenue rights over the land, not as the owner of all lands.
Why do you think, Professor Chakravarti?
Yes.
So, Professor Chakravarti, you are talking about this confusion that was there in the historiography in the 1950s and 60s, that you very well explained was dependent on the normative text that made a claim that all the land in Asiatic society actually belonged to the king, and that is why king could have, some sort of demand or ultimate authority over the land. And taxation in the revenue system is also then seen as another extension of that dimension. So while you are arguing in a very interesting manner that inscriptions actually ask us to change this kind of view and look at the Agrarian society in a more dynamic way, where things were changing, they were not static. So once made claim in our Shastra is not going to hold till 6th century when Guptas were ruling.
Exactly.
So in that sense, what do you think was the basis of this confusion? Erroneous reading of the textual sources or not giving importance to the epigraphic material?
I think it was, first of all, there was not much confusion. It was that, once again, the framing of questions, why you raise certain issues at a particular time by certain historians. Take for it as early as 1910, when Vincent Smith wrote his very popular, almost textbook-like work. He made a point that all lands belong to the king, citing the statement of Megasthenes. Because at that time, the British government was trying to enforce new laws which would be essentially framed from the point of view of the advantage to the colonial government. In that case, if the historical tradition could be established that in India, it is not the private individual or in the community that had some say on the land question, but it always final authority rests with the ruler, then the historical tradition gets validity, and in that case the history supports the present case, as it often is. And second point is that some of the texts, Dharma Shastra literature, takes the view of the land, of the question of that the ruler is the master of all lands. But the point is, Dharma Shastra texts are also very divergent on certain issues and can give multiple answers by the multiple school of theorists. So there are positions even within the Dharma Shastra which would strongly recognize how the question of individual proprietary right is indicated by the use of two roots of Sanskrit verbs. One is swatva and swamitva. It was pointed out by U.N. Ghoshal, masterly analysis, which means full-fledged ownership. While the words coming out of the word root bhuj, bhoga, enjoyment, does not indicate, means only enjoyment and not full proprietary ownership. And this is remarkably figuring in land grant records. The record I first referred to, the Nahabana record of the early 1st, 2nd century AD from Nasik, says that the person who is selling land to the son-in-law of the ruler, he is selling land because he has swatva, pitu satakam, pitri satakam, inherited from his father. That's why he has swatva, ownership. On the other hand, if you look at the 7th century inscription from Bengal by the rulers in Samatata, the clear understanding of 3 levels of land-related access. I don't call it ownership. In one case, there is an indication of someone is an owner. Then someone is bhujyamanaka, enjoyer. And then still differentiated, one who is krishyamanaka, mere cultivating, not even with the right to enjoy and definitely not the owner. So over a particular area, there can be 3 types of relationship, an asymmetrical relationship in terms of the access to landed resources. That is possible, and inscriptions bear this out very clearly, almost the asymmetrical tiers that can be seen in this kind of records. It's possible, yes.
Professor Chakravarti, so what is actually the scenario of agriculture? So can you give us some light on the exchange of agrarian products in the rural level?
Yeah, inscription do bear it out because first of all, one has to find out what the inscription is recorded for. If you look for a mere prashasti, where like the Allahabad pillar inscription, you will find data on agrarian products because Harishchandra did not intend to write on that. Actually, no inscription is intended to give you ready-made available data on economic life because these are essentially products of the court, highlighting the achievements of the ruler or his munificence, his greatness. This is essentially emanating with an elite point of view. But incidental notices can be had. Like if you look at, say, the question of the land grants giving details of the products like paddy, like other types of cash crops like bubak, which is supari or betel nuts. Sometimes even the sale of shakobartaku, that is green vegetable and leafy vegetable, in a 10th century marketplace, a mandapika like mandi, in a place presently close to Jabalpur. On the other hand, if you go to the coastal areas, and inscriptions naturally would highlight coastal products, including production of plant items like narikela or coconut, which are one of the typical features of the rural coastal settlements close to the sea, whether on the west coast or on the east coast. Sometimes you will find mention of, say, cash crops like oil seeds, which are vital for the production of oil, not only for edible purposes, but most of these products are being meant for donation to the temple, where the perpetual burning of lamp before the deity, whether a Buddhist deity or the Brahmanical deity or a goddess figure, irrespective of that, burning of the lamp is essential. Perpetual burning of the lamp. And lamp can only be burnt if you have the supply of oil. Oil therefore comes from pressing the oil seeds. Oil seeds an agrarian product, but this is what may be called a commercial crop. And that you will find in inscriptions if the context is, say, the burning of oil before the deity. So the reference to oil seeds and also reference to the donation of such oil before the deity, which is considered as a pious act. It is not always the king gives it. It may be individual donors thinking of a pious act is giving oil or oil mills to a temple, and without the production of oil seeds you cannot think of production of the edible or the oil for burning the lamp. And the references to crops can even come from an urban context. Let us take into account, perhaps the case in point is the Mahasthan inscriptions from northern part of Bangladesh, the earliest known urban center in Bengal in about 3rd century BCE during the time of the Mauryas, where the reference is to a koshthagar or a storehouse. Storehouses are typical features as a public building in an urban context. But what are being stored? Stored are the items, essentially food grains, dhanya, tila, which is an oil seed. So these already are there, and similar kinds of crops were being stored and to be released during emergency situation. In another inscription of the same time, that is the Maurya period, 3rd century BC, coming from northeastern part of present Uttar Pradesh, Gorakhpur area. This is the Sagora copper plate, and interestingly the items that are stored, all agrarian products, are to be stored in the Koshtagara, which actually is related to the agrarian scenario, but its location is in an urban space. That is available in the record, which also depicts perhaps an artist's impression of the shape of the storehouse, which is described as a 3-story storehouse. So agrarian products naturally will move from the actual field to the storehouse, from the actual field to the site of the oil press, from the oil press then to the temple. And this is particularly seen in about 10th, 11th century inscriptions from Deccan and the deep south, where there are mercantile groups who handle large-scale agrarian products. The Sasirbaru groups, the Chittiravedi group, which are actually cultivators group, but who are engaged in the handling of agrarian products in the form of grain trade. So they provide the crucial link between the consumer and the producer of agrarian commodities, and which also travel. This is indicated by the epigraphic record. I'll be a little bit more explicit on that. When these agrarian products are mentioned, take for example in the case of Konkan records, very clear indication of betel nuts, pugophala, of various types of edible crops, and then it also says that how these are being carried to the market, and the merchants themselves impose a cess, self-imposed, not a tax, which they donate to the temple. This is the context where we find the reference to agricultural crops. So in that case, they say something is being carried on shoulders, something is being carried, agrarian products, in cartloads, sometimes the oil in jars, and then the self-imposed cesses are specified in terms of how the transportation has been made, whether by on shoulders or on jars or on cartloads or on baskets. So the rate of cess would vary according to this.
What about the non-agrarian sector, particularly the trade and craft?
Thanks, Jinsy, for raising this issue, because we have been talking a little bit more on the agrarian scenario. I have no problem, because after all, Indian social economic life till today are rooted to the rural and agrarian scenario. The largest number of Indian population are engaged in agrarian activities, but agrarian life is not divorced from the non-agricultural sector of the economy, by which I would like to bring in the craftsmen and also mercantile activities. This is once again a new area where inscriptions are being tapped to generate data. I would give you some examples of this. I already spoke of the donative records, which are abounding from in the broad chronological range between 200 BCE and 300 CE, with various sites cutting across North India, Central India, Western Deccan, Eastern Deccan. They go even to the deep south, where Tamil Brahmi inscriptions record the donations. Now, most of the donors are craftspeople, artisans, like the carpenters, like the karmakar, kammar, that is the blacksmith, like the reed maker, which is called konachika. And see the inscriptions indicating how these are specialized. One who is the carpenter is not the reed maker, and one who is the blacksmith is differentiated from the kasakara, kamsyakara, the brazier. I can multiply many such cases, but I'll deal with something else. Along with this, you will find, only found in the inscriptions, how many of these artisanal groups tended to form into professional bodies which are called shrenis. Shrenis are already figuring in the Dharmashastra literature, but only inscriptions give us a very specific function of the shrenis performing as a rudimentary credit network system. They were receiving from different strata of the society perpetual monetary endowment. A case in point is from Nasik. During the time once again of Nahapana's reign, early 2nd century AD, where at Nasik or ancient Govardhana, there are two weavers organizations, specific weavers organization, Kaulika Nikaya, Apara Kaulika Nikaya. And once again, the Nahapana's son-in-law Usamadata makes monetary deposits, not donations, monetary deposits to these two organizations. The money has been categorically mentioned, the amount, which is almost like the present day fixed deposit in a bank, which you don't touch the principal, but enjoy the interest. Vriddhi bholche, the term is vriddhi in inscription, interest. And the interest will be spent for the upkeep of the necessities of Buddhist monks in a nearby Buddhist monastery. Now this is the role of the organization almost as a rudimentary bank. And except in inscription, this role is never present in any other kind of literature. And there are many such cases. It would also indicate how the artisanal groups were functioning between merchants, craftsmen, and also Buddhist monasteries. The nexus is very clear. On the other hand, take for example, many of the records would talk about the remission from the taxes on salt, that is salt manufacturing. These inscriptions are often land grants, mostly coming from coastal areas where salt production is quite natural. It is the ruler's prerogative to extract a levy on the production of salt, which is considered to be, in early Indian tradition, almost like a mining activity. Because you are actually working out salt either from the rock salt or from the sea salt, seawater. The ruler levies some licensing fees, which in some cases the ruler gives a remission. The term is alavana khala. That is, on a special occasion, the recipient of the land grant would not be to be paid the taxes on salt production. So this is another manufacturing activity. And similarly, such manufacturing activities can be seen in terms of the artisanal groups. Sometimes the names of villages relate to the professional bodies who are stationed there, like the 592 AD inscription from Kathiawar, where a large number of merchants have been asked to settle down at a marketplace, Lohatak Grama, by the local ruler. He gives many other sort of inducement to the merchants, but also it allows a large number of craftsmen who supply their products to the mercantile group. Among them there are potters, among them there are the blacksmiths, braziers, including the manufacturer of indigo, who are using indigo production vats, and all of which are taxable. Once again, this is something we have to take into account. Many of the artisanal products are taxed. They are generating revenues, which can be in money, which can also be in kind. And this is particularly captured in the term Karu Kara. In Satavana inscription, Kara is tax, Karu, craftsman, artisan. So the Kara or tax imposed on the karus, that is the artisanal groups. It is there. And regarding the merchants, this is something we are now paying more and more attention to. First, there are categorical references to merchants of various types, sometimes as simple baniks, sometimes as sarthavas, sometimes as srishtis. Once again, I may take you to Bengal scenario, early Gupta period, 5th, 6th centuries, where not only we come across the Nagara Srishti, the chief merchant of the city, the Sarthavas. Please note, the Sartava are the caravan traders, and the Srishti, the money merchant, are not held identical. They are two different types of merchants. The Vanik is a merchant in general. They are so prominent that they are participating in the local administrative body, helping out the district administrator without themselves being salaried officials of the state. So obviously they are emerging as elite components in the local administration, representative of the elite groups in the local administration. Similarly, inscriptions perhaps are one of the best indicators that Indians were seafaring groups. The notion in the Dharma Shastra that you don't cross Kalapani, particularly for the Brahmanas, that if you do so, you will incur pollution and sin. This is simply blasted out in epigraphic records. We have the best possible indication coming in the very recent times by the remarkable researches of Ingo Straug, who have found 193 inscriptions in the Socotra Island in the Western Indian Ocean. These 193 inscriptions are in Brahmi and in Sanskrit language, datable between 1st and 5th centuries AD, which record the actual visit by Indian population, usually from the western seaboard of India. Ports like Bharukacha, Bharugaza and Hatab, Hastakabapra are categorically mentioned that people came from these ports to the island of Sumatra. Therefore, they are not taking a walk or undertaking an overland journey. You have to cross the sea by ships. And interestingly, along with the inscription, the image of ships, once again, these are very crude images. They may not have painted the actual image of the ship, but there is a very clear image. They crossed the sea by ships. And there are even names of Brahmanas who have crossed the sea. So the Dharma Shastra dictum actually are not insurmountable. Second, the inscriptions of slightly later period, particularly from Western India, speaks of mercantile organization like Banigrama. The term grammar should not be taken merely in the sense of a village. The term grammar in Sanskrit means a collection, an association. So Banigrama means an association of merchants, mercantile group, mercantile professional body, like the artisanal body. So we have got 503 AD, 506 AD, 519 AD from Gujarat, such reference to Banigramam, where local merchant Vastavya and Vaideshya, that is non-local, not foreigners, non-local merchants combined together to form the Banigramam. The context is their pious donation to a Vishnu temple. And these Banigramam figure in a very prominent way in the just mentioned the 592 inscription from Kathiawar, which was studied by D.C. Sarkar, which was studied very elaborately by D.D. Kosambi, as the case of how the rulers induced merchants to settle down at a port area. And the best example of the mercantile organization are seen in inscriptions from peninsular India and the deep south, where we find the celebrated 500 Swamis of Ayavole, that is Ayol in Karnataka. And they are not limited to Karnataka, they emanate from Karnataka, but their inscriptions are found in Karnataka, in Andhra, in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in fact outside the subcontinent. From Sri Lanka, from Thailand, from Myanmar, from Sumatra, from the area in Java, and also we have inscriptions even from China, recording the activities of these mercantile groups, what Karashima would call, and also Subbaraju, as an umbrella-like organization of the 500 Swamis, within which there were smaller mercantile groups. They were reaching these distant places across the Bay of Bengal and making donations to religious shrines, or they were patrons of the religious shrines, and interestingly, they give the account of their business activities in a eulogistic manner. And Karashima and Subbaraju very rightly note that the mercantile bodies, while inscribing their pious acts overseas, outside India, they write their own Prashasti eulogies instead of the royal eulogy, which is the more common form. The mercantile bodies speak eloquently about their own mercantile activities, their patronages to cultural and religious activities, and thereby record their inscriptions. And very interestingly, from Southeast Asia, we have got bilingual records. This has major implications in social and cultural scenarios. As the merchants are traveling far and wide across the sea, they are obviously meeting people who are not speakers of Tamil language or even Dravidian language. So we have Tamil Japanese inscriptions. We have Tamil Chinese inscriptions from east coast of China. Obviously they were interacting with local people, so you have to be bilingual in order to communicate. Without communication, there is no business. So this is a social and cultural act which is enmeshed within the economic act of transaction. And inscriptions also record in coastal areas the Novittakas, the shipowning merchants, who are also known in the Perso-Arabic inscriptions of 12th, 13th centuries as Nakhuda. In fact, in some inscriptions, Nakhudas and Novittakas are abbreviated, which means that they are so common a vocabulary in the coastal society that an abbreviated term Nakhu and No would make their position intelligible to the readers of the inscription. So, and they are found in the coastal areas. The Nakhudas and Novittakas as very distinct category, shipowning merchants, fabulously rich merchants, obviously investing in shipping business, which is a risky venture and which would require investment of enormous amount of money. And they figure naturally in inscriptions in the coastal area. Both Indic merchants and the merchants from the Islamic world, they figure quite prominently in this kind of records.
And we also have examples of this kind of expatriate merchant communities, diasporic merchant communities coming from different regions to settle there, as Professor Chakravarti was pointing out about another such inscription.
And particularly the case of Kerala.
Yes, particularly the case of Kerala,
Kerala, where we have
two such records by the Chera rulers, which have been given to two different communities.
One to the Christian community, one to the Jewish community.
Yes.
And when the Jewish, and every time other merchants are present as signatories or witnesses to this act. And therefore the accommodation of diversity, of ethnic groups, of religious groups, of social groups, culturally diverse, interfaith communities, communications, these can be seen if you read between the lines. Inscriptions may not be explicit, but you have to read between the lines. And take for example what I pointed out in the case of the Sokotra records. These are not donative records, not land grants, not prashastis. These are one-line, two-line records. People are noting that they have visited the islands. So there is every possibility that those who have written their names actually inscribed their names on the walls, because you don't have actual professional scribes and engravers in the ship journeying along with these visitors to a distant place. So these people are literate groups. That also is an indication. These are literate groups.
So though you have raised the issue of revenue system earlier, but just now as you have spoken on the agrarian and non-agrarian sector, you have presented a detailed account. That's why I would like to ask you again that what was the scenario of taxation and revenue system? Could you throw some light more?
We know the revenue system through the land grants mostly because they deal with the transfer of revenues in favor of the recipient of the land grant. And therefore, the list is which kind of revenues are being remitted. What are being exempt? This is actually exemption list from taxes. Therefore, if these are exemptions, the list also indicates that these were normally the heads of revenue and remission is given on special occasions. The interesting point is two points. One, in many of the inscriptions, particularly from North India, between the Gupta period and 13th century, 5th to 13th century, inscriptions are categorically recording that taxes are pida, afflictions on the subjects. This is a remarkable admission that it's a pida, affliction, pain on the taxpayer. And remember, one of the earliest of such expression comes in the Prashasti of Rudradana, where he said that when he had to repair the broken, damaged dam of Sudarshana, he did not take recourse to imposing extortionate taxes on the people, with excessive taxes, kara vishti pranaya. This pranaya is an emergency taxation. But he financed the repair work from his own treasury, which was overflowing with legally levied taxes like boli, jatha abhapraptai boli shulka bhavai, like legal taxes, normal taxes like bhaga, share of the agrarian produce, boli, which is a kind of a levy on the land, and shulka is taxes on tolls and customs, commercial taxes. Interestingly, if we look at the terms of revenue or revenue officials who are in charge of collecting those taxes under different heads, one gets an impression that the list is becoming more and more elaborate. As one proceeds from, say, 5th, 6th century AD grants to 12th, 13th century AD grants, in other words, the rulers were increasing the burden of taxation on the subjects. As centuries wore on, the demands became much more proliferated and diversified. And one such case of what may be called the pida is the repeated references to the imposition of vishti or forced labor on the villagers. Figuring in repeatedly in inscriptions, I can recall that at least in one Bhakataka record of 6th century, early 6th century, there is even the mention of sarva vishti. That is, vishti is not even of one type, of varied types of forced labor. There is also an indication of vishti, which is called bhotta vishti, coming from Nepal inscriptions, which mean that you pay or you render forced labor in carrying merchandise on your shoulders in hilly tracts. This is a form of forced labor. Instead of rendering labor on agricultural fields, you carry loads in the mountainous tracts. And this is also happening more or less similarly in the Kashmir hilly region, not known from inscription, but more or less the same kind of situation recorded by Kalana in his Rajadhara. So, taxation and local products are seen as resources and mentioned as taxation items. Like if you look at the inscriptions of Bengal and Assam, repeated references of Samra Madhuka, that is mango and mohua trees, are seen as resources which are to be tapped. for the maintenance of the Doni. You go to the coastal areas, the term is Salavana, that is, the taxes from salt manufacturing will be given to the, credited to the Doni, because it's a typical coastal area. If you go to the Odissan records, it records Samatsya Sakachapa, because fish and tortoise are quite abounding in the local surroundings in Odisha. So there is also pattern, overall pattern, but there are also remarkable regional diversities. And this you will also come across, as B.D. Chattopadhyay showed, in the arrangement of the rural settlements and the rural irrigation network, the use of hydraulic resources. In Bengal, you will find countless numbers of references to streams, rivulets, big rivers, because Bengal is a deltaic area. And therefore, less of artificial irrigation projects, only kupas and talagas, wells and pushkari. If you go to the inscriptions of the Rajasthan area, which is dry, with more aridity and less moisture in the soil, the groundwater level is much lower at greater depth. So you won't come across references in inscription to streams, rivulets, water bodies, but to bapis, meaning baulis, stepwells. If you go to the inscriptions of Karnataka, neither you come across the water bodies replete in Bengal inscriptions or in Assam inscriptions, and nor bapis or baulis, stepwells, or araghattas, water wheels, like in western Uttar Pradesh, or in the case of western India, Gujarat, Rajasthan, Haryana. You get in Karnataka reference to tanks, kere or gere. You go to Tamil Nadu, then the famous inscription of Bhairavega Uttarameru in the Pallava and also the early Cholo times would indicate the tank irrigation with sluice gates, and interestingly managed by local self bodies like the Ur assembly, the Brahmodaya assembly, who look after the upkeep of local tanks and irrigation projects. There can be Prashasti like very elaborate description of irrigation project. The best indication is that of the 2nd century AD Sudarshana lake, the damage and the repair. The history of the Sudarshana lake from late 4th century BCE to middle of 5th century is known from two inscriptions. One, the Junagadh rock inscription of Rudradaman, and one second from Junagadh itself, the rock, the Prashasti of Skandagupta. What is very interesting, the name Sudarshana becomes so celebrated, obviously through epigraphic records, that the Bhakatakas in their own area began to name some irrigation projects as Sudarshana. This is an emulation of the same name. It's almost become an iconic feature of a large dam, river-based irrigation project patronized by ruling groups across centuries. So that we can point out.
Sir, which section of the society was engaged in agrarian and non-agrarian sectors of the economy? Do the epigraphic documents inform us anything on this?
Yeah, the interesting point is the inscriptions, normally what we find, if we talk of the cultivators and the merchants, we immediately try to bracket them as Vaishyas, as indicated by the Dharma Shastras. You will rarely come across even the term Vaishya in inscriptions. Neither as a cultivator nor as a merchant, except one or two cases. In Odisha there is a Vaishyagrahara in an inscription. Settlement of the Vaishyas. Like the Brahmana settlement, the Vaishyas are being asked, probably merchants who were invited by ruler. Otherwise you won't come across the Vaishyas in inscriptions. The term is Karshaka, Halika, sometimes Gahapati, sometimes Kutumbins, sometimes Mahatta. Now these terms, their implication can only be understood in the context. This I must point out as a methodology, that mere reading of the inscriptions may not give you the actual import of certain terms. the context in which the term appears is as important as the actual term itself. Take for example, if in a Buddhist monastery, like that in Kerala, a cultivator, simply as Halika, says that he has given a huge cave for the residence of the monks in the cave dwelling, Loyana at Kerala. The kind of architecture that was patronized by this Halika would immediately indicate, if you take the context, that he is not an ordinary cultivator. He is a very resourceful cultivator who is able to part with a considerable portion of his resources to patronize that kind of a monument. Similarly, the term Karshak, figuring in most of the land grants, if you look at the context, they may not categorically be called ordinary peasants, because there are terms like Kutumbikas and Mahattaras in inscriptions. The term Kutumbika means what we call the well-to-do peasants, not very rich landholder, well-to-do peasants, what can be called the Rayats, who have some land, the actual peasant, landowning peasant of small plots. The Mahattaras are a little bit more affluent. Both are important categories in rural society. They often appear in land grants as witnesses to the actual procedure of land donation or land transaction. They are eminent social groups in the village. But Mahattaras and Kutumbikas are not identical. I can recall, if I recall correctly, there are records from history, particularly from Bengal, where in one inscription there are 72 names of Kutumbikas, only 9 names of Mahattaras. And B.D. Chakravarti very rightly pointed out that Mahattaras are more in upward scale than the Kutumbikas, who number more in the society. And interestingly, the towns like Gopati, who are rich landholders, landowners, and regular donors to the Buddhist establishment up to 3rd, 4th centuries AD in various parts of India, they gradually disappear from the land grant records as a category of landholding groups. On the other hand, we come across Kutumbikas, Mahattaras, they too gradually disappear, and only simple Karshakas, Halikas, which literally actually means a plowman, not even a peasant. So the change in terminology in the inscriptions from 8th, 9th centuries onward up to 13th century would indicate that cultivators are there, but their social position, their eminence, or their attachment to their landed property are undergoing significant changes. The Karshakas are there in between the Krishyamanaka type of cultivators who are possibly cultivating the lands of others. These others are Bhajyamanaka, Bhogika, the holders of actual land grants, mostly the Brahmanas, or the monks in a Buddhist monastery. Jati Varna norms would not allow a Brahmana normally to touch the plough. The members of the Nalanda monastery are not expected to till the soil which have been granted to the Nalanda monastery. The inscriptions are completely silent who are actually cultivating the lands given to these religious institutions or religious persons. The silence is eloquent. These are mostly the unstated Karshakas or Halikas who do not perhaps possess land, but who are now forced to cultivate the soils of others, the enjoyers of the land grants. So the asymmetry in the rural social network is now more and more pronounced. In the early medieval times. And this is very clear if we look into one of the very recently discovered land grant from the Cholo times, dated between 1053-1056, of the time of the Cholo ruler Rajadiraja, also actually of the time of Rajendra II. The land grant is issued in the time of Veera Rajendra 1063 to 1070. The largest Cholo land grant, 86 plates, recording the details of land grants, but which also shows that if someone defies the laws, the persons can be not only beaten but also can be killed. This is the legal provision in the land grant, indicating the tremendous control of the authority of the upper strata of the society on the lower and the relatively disadvantaged social groups who could be punished with beating and also with capital punishment. That is very clearly recorded in the inscription, wonderfully studied by Subbarao. Very recent publication of this record has come.
In fact, some of the temple inscriptions from Kerala also record those kind of provisions of penalty.
Penalty.
If the cultivator is not actually doing cultivation on the behalf of the temple, then there are a set of penalties along with the dates. So if you are not doing it, paying the due to the temple and delaying it by 6 months,
Yeah.
then you will have to pay this much amount of money.
Very
After
major
that-
stricture.
Yes, very
major stricture.
And ultimately you will be committing Panch Mahapatakas, so which is the great sins if you are not doing it.
Five sins you are.
Yes.
So the religious sanctions are connected
Also
with your
connected with this.
sort of sacred duty, and that has been imposed through
On
the
the
land grant records.
Exactly.
So that is the scenario.
Sir, do the epigraphic sources throw light on the Varnajati system of early India, which is primarily captured in the textual sources, and the issue of gender relations also, which again has been described mainly in the literary sources? In such a scenario, do the inscriptions present a different picture than the textual sources?
Yes, in a way, inscriptions have provided information not otherwise sanctioned by the Dharma Shastra laws. I have a very favorite instance which I often have pointed out. This is 466 AD, the time of Skandagupta's reign. In Ganga Yamuna Valley, supposed to be the cradle land of Brahmanical culture, in what is very erroneously so called the Gupta Golden Age. Why? Because all the Shastric norms are being performed. Ideal age, the revival of Brahmanism. In that time, 466, at a place called Indrapura, which has yielded an inscription of the time of Skandagupta. This is Indore, not Indore of Madhya Pradesh, but Indore near the area of Mirat Bulandshahr in Uttar Pradesh. The inscription records the pious donation of cash by two merchant brothers, which is quite okay and common. Merchants often do that, the patrons. They give money and other resources to temple. They gave money to a sun temple. Once again, money is to be given as a perpetual deposit. The interest is to be paid for burning a perpetual lamp before the image of the sun god. This is the context. Naturally, the donors would give their own identity. They are two brothers, Achala Varman and Bhrugutiman, and how they introduce themselves as Kshatriya Baniks. This falls flat on the Dharma Shastra norms. Kshatriya Baniks. If you are a Kshatriya, you cannot be a Banik. If you are a Banik, you cannot aspire for Kshatriya status, but they have done so. Obviously, their profession and their Varna status do not match. Yet, the money earned by them by transgressing the Varna Jati norms is not considered impure by the temple authority who accepted the money for their patronage purpose. So, the Varna Jati norms simply are not as insurmountable as it looks. Similarly, in once again the very famous case of the situation in the non-change of the Gotra in the marriage of Prabhavati Devi, the daughter of Chandragupta II, given in marriage to the Vakataka household, who herself issues inscriptions when her husband died and the two sons are too young. So she acts as the queen regent, and there she gives the indication that she retains not only her maiden family name Gupta, but also the maiden title, the maiden Gotra name Dharini Gotra, not the Vishnu Viruddha Gotra of the Vakatakas. There is, if once again a Vakataka inscription is to be read following B.N. Mukherjee, a Vakataka ruler is marrying his Bhaginei, his niece, because this is valid in the Deccan and South Indian context. This is impossible in North Indian context, but possible in peninsular context. So the regional variation is very clear here. And in the case of the regional character, I would like to point out to a 10th century record from present-day northeastern part of Bangladesh, which politically is in Bangladesh, but which comes within the ambit of the northeastern part of the subcontinent in the Kachar area, Surma Barat Valley, and not very far from what is Kamarupa of ancient times, where in 10th century, early 10th century, 930, a massive Brahmana settlement is created, called a Brahmapura by a local ruler of the Chandra dynasty. And there we find not only the Brahmanas, it is said that 6,000 Brahmanas were settled, we do not know, it may be an exaggerated account, but very large number of Brahmanas must have been settled. There are identical divinities worshipped in that Brahmapura, but the identical divinities are worshipped in two separate mathas within the same religious complex. One is called the Bangala Veshya, one is called the Deshantari. The region is present as Sylhet. Within Sylhet you cannot place the Bangala area, which is the lower part of present day Bangladesh. So people have come from outside to Sylhet, possibly from Bangala area, southeastern part of present Bangladesh, and definitely from elsewhere, which is called Deshantari. There must have been some regional differences in the two communities, so that even the identical divinities could not be worshipped in a common shrine that required two separate shrines. Identical divinities worshipped in two separate shrines within the same precincts. On the other hand, women's questions cannot be categorically answered because many of the inscriptions are coming from the court circles or by the donors. Sometimes the women are donors in figuring in Buddhist and Jaina context. We have a remarkable case of a courtesan, a Ganika, donating lavishly at Mathura, recording that she was a Ganika or a courtesan. Her mother too was a Ganika or courtesan. And the gift is being accepted in the Jaina circle. It is perhaps next to impossible in the Brahmanical context if a Ganika wishes to donate to a Brahmanical temple. The Buddhist and the Jaina institutions perhaps is a little bit more open in accepting such patronages from the Cartesians. As I was telling that female donors, both from the category of nuns and also lay women, figure quite prominently in the donative records in largely Buddhist but sometimes also in Jaina religious establishments, because this is quite clear from the donative records. Other than that, sometimes important queens may figure prominently in inscriptions. Once again as donors. And that is a long history. If you find Ashoka's queen, Karubaki, as a donor. But please also note that she is seen as a Mahishi, someone's wife, or as someone's mother, especially the mother of a son, Tivarama. So the question of her independent stature is not so prominent, though she is an important donor. She is either seen as someone's wife or someone's mother. This is one point. A major exceptional case is the inscriptions of the remarkable queen from the Kakati realm in Andhra Pradesh in the early 13th century. The daughter named Rudramma, the daughter of the very powerful Kakatiya ruler of 13th century, Ganapati. Ganapati did not have a male heir, so the throne passed on to the female heir rather than the usual pattern of the succession passing on to the brother of the collateral branch. So Rudramma is ruling, and in fact her rule draws praise even from our Gopal. Interestingly, she always figures in the inscriptions as Rudra Maharaja, though her portraiture is that of a warrior woman on the back of a horse and clad in a typical warrior attire. So that's a completely different image of a very powerful queen on her own. She was married. Her husband rarely figures in a prominent way in the inscriptions. And she is figuring very prominently in her records. And interestingly, a record of her time comes from Malkapuram in Andhra Pradesh, 13th century, where a huge matta is established by a priest of the Mattomairaga Saiva sect. And elaborate provisions have been made for different people, not merely the religious groups, but also the service groups within the matta. And there is a peculiar provision that there are Ganakas who could be the astrologers or could be accountants. The provision is there. If the Ganakas are dead or one Ganaka has died, his wife would now hold the post of the dead husband. Now that would indicate perhaps the professional proficiency, ability of the wife also in the husband's profession. If Ganaka is an accountant, then she perhaps also learned the craft of accountancy. These are only sort of snippets. You have to interpret a lot on the basis of certain quantum of epigraphic statements. But one has to read between the lines. Often the inscriptions will give you only a little bit of a hint, but the hints can become quite eloquent if you care to listen what Karashima said, the whispering of the inscriptions.
Thank you, sir, for enlightening us on the
I enjoyed the session, and thanks for raising the questions.
Names of epigraphic documents. Thank you.
And thanks
Dr.
to
Digvijay.
all of you for
Thanks to Devdutta and Jinsy also for joining us in the discussion.
raising interesting questions which I could speak on.